A young thug targets a decorated Vietnam veteran at a Brooklyn diner, grabbing the 78-year-old man's wrist and demanding his wallet and watch. The punk and his crew terrorize the elderly soldier while other customers freeze in fear, but one quiet stranger in the corner booth slowly sets down his newspaper. What the arrogant bully doesn't know is that this customer is Mike Tyson himself. The thug has just committed the worst mistake of his pathetic life, assaulting an American hero in front of a man who spent decades destroying opponents with devastating precision. While the punk threatens the helpless veteran, the former heavyweight champion rises to his full, intimidating height. The restaurant goes dead silent as patrons recognize the legend, but the clueless thug keeps running his mouth, completely unaware he's about to face the most dangerous man on the planet. The veteran sees his savior and knows justice is about to be delivered with bone-crushing force. What happens when you pick on a war hero in front of Iron Mike? Will the punk survive learning why some legends never fade? What happened next would terrorize the thug for the rest of his miserable life. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you, the alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the Brooklyn dawn at exactly 6:30 a.m., same as every morning for the past 6 months. Mike Tyson's eyes opened immediately. No grogginess, no gradual awakening. 40 years of disciplined living had programmed his body like a machine. He rolled out of bed and dropped to the hardwood floor, knocking out 50 perfect push-ups without counting. His apartment was sparse, almost monastic. A bed, a chair, a small table holding a few books, and yesterday's newspaper. Boxing memorabilia lined one wall. Photos from glory days when the whole world knew his name and feared his power. After a quick shower, Tyson dressed in his uniform. Dark jeans, black t-shirt, white sneakers. Simple clothes for a man trying to live a simple life. He caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror, gray threading through his beard now, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in his prime. But his shoulders still filled the doorframe, and his hands still looked like hammers. The walk to Rosie's diner took exactly 12 minutes. Brooklyn was waking up around him. Kids heading to school, workers catching buses, the eternal rhythm of a neighborhood that had seen everything and survived it all. Tyson moved through it quietly, drawing glances but no recognition. In this corner of the world, he was just another middle-aged black man trying to mind his own business. Rosie sat on the corner of Flatbush and Bergen, a throwback to simpler times with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that could wake the dead. The bell above the door announced his arrival with a cheerful chime that seemed out of place in the city's harsh morning light. "Morning, honey," Betty called from behind the counter. She was 50-something with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Usual spots waiting for you." Tyson nodded his thanks and made his way to the corner booth, back to the wall, clear view of the entrance. Old habits from a life where everyone wanted something from him, where danger could wear a friendly face and a business suit. Betty appeared with coffee before he'd fully settled, the ceramic mug warming his scarred knuckles. "Fresh pot," she said with a smile that reminded him of every good woman who'd ever shown him kindness. "Appreciate you, Betty." The newspaper crinkled as he opened it to the sports section, scanning headlines about fighters he'd never heard of making millions. For fights that wouldn't have lasted 3 rounds in his day. The sweet science had become something else, more show than substance, more talk than action. Around him, the diner filled with its regular morning crowd. Eddie, the cook, gave him a respectful nod from behind the grill. The man was maybe 40, built compact and solid. Ex-Navy, Tyson had guessed from the way he carried himself, straight spine, efficient movements, alert eyes that missed nothing. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly how Tyson liked it. Outside, Brooklyn continued its ancient dance of survival and hope. Inside, he found the peace that had eluded him for so many years. Then the bell chimed again, and an old man with a cane stepped through the door. Frank Kowalski moved with the careful dignity of a man who'd earned every one of his 78 years. The carved wooden cane wasn't just for show. An old war wound had left him with a permanent limp that only got worse on cold mornings like this one. But his spine stayed straight, shoulders back, chin up. Some habits never died. The Bronze Star and Vietnam Service Medal on his military jacket caught the diner's fluorescent light, small pieces of metal that represented more courage than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. His silver hair was combed neat, his face clean-shaven despite the slight tremor in his hands that made simple tasks take a little longer each year. "Morning, Frank," Betty called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Booth three's waiting for you." "Thank you, darling." His voice carried the hint of an accent. Polish immigrant parents who'd raised their son to believe in America, duty, and doing right by your neighbors. Frank settled into what everyone at Rosie's knew as his booth, the same spot he'd occupied every morning for 3 years. After Margaret died, the apartment had become too quiet, too full of memories and empty spaces. The diner gave him purpose, somewhere to be, people who expected him. Betty poured his coffee without being asked, the ritual as comfortable as an old song. "How'd you sleep, honey?" "Like a soldier," Frank replied, which was his standard answer. Some nights were better than others, but complaining never helped anyone. "How's that grandson of yours doing?" "Starting high school next month." "Can you believe it?" Betty shook her head, amazed by time's passage. "The usual this morning?" "Please." Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, crispy bacon. The same breakfast he'd eaten in the army 50 years ago, when the world was simpler and enemies wore uniforms you could recognize. Eddie emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "Frank, you catch the game last night." "Bottom of the ninth had me on the edge of my seat." Frank smiled, grateful for the connection. Eddie was a good man, served his country, came home, built a decent life. The kind of young man America needed. More of .as they talked baseball. Frank's fingers absently touched his wallet through his jacket pocket. Force of habit these days. Too many stories in the news about seniors getting robbed, scammed, forgotten by a world that moved too fast for old bones to follow. His wedding ring caught the light as he lifted his coffee cup. 45 years of marriage, and Margaret's face still came to him clear as yesterday. She'd have liked Betty, would have enjoyed the gentle rhythm of this place. From across the diner, Frank noticed the big man in the corner booth watching him with quiet interest. Something familiar about those eyes, that careful stillness. Military, maybe? Frank had gotten good at recognizing the type. Men who'd seen things, done things, carried weight that never fully went away. Frank raised his coffee mug slightly in acknowledgement. The man returned the gesture with a small nod. No words needed, just two old warriors recognizing each other across a crowded room. The bell above the door chimed again, a sharp sound that somehow felt different this time. Frank looked up to see 3 young men entering, their energy wrong from the first step. They moved like predators, alert, calculating, hungry. The temperature in Rosie's seemed to drop 10 degrees. The 3 young men brought trouble through the door like smoke from a fire. Derek Williams led the way, 22 years old, with the kind of swagger that came from never facing real consequences. His expensive sneakers squeaked against the linoleum, and gold chains caught the light around his neck. Behind him came Marcus and TJ, followers looking for direction from someone who talked loud and acted tough. They'd follow Derek into hell if he promised them an easy score on the other side. Derek's eyes swept the diner like a hawk surveying a field of rabbits. Too many witnesses, but also too many targets. Old people with social security checks, working folks with wallets full of cash, nobody who looked like they could put up a real fight. Then he spotted the jackpot. The old man in booth 3 practically glowed with opportunity. Military jacket with shiny medals, probably got a nice veteran's pension. Expensive watch on his wrist that looked like it meant something. The way he sat, straight and proud, screamed old school values and old school money. "Coffee," Derek told Betty, sliding onto a counter stool. His voice carried the kind of casual arrogance that made good people uncomfortable. Marcus and TJ flanked him, their presence turning the friendly diner into something colder. Betty poured 3 cups with the efficiency of someone who'd served every type of customer Brooklyn could produce. But her smile was gone, replaced by the careful politeness of a woman who'd learned to read trouble. Derek stirred sugar into coffee he had no intention of drinking, using the spoon's metallic clink to mask his whispered instructions. Old soldier. Boy in the booth. Watch, wallet, probably keeps his cash in the inside pocket. Marcus, you watch the door. TJ, keep an eye on the cook. The plan was simple because it had worked before. Intimidate the target, grab what they could, and disappear. into Brooklyn's maze of streets before anyone could react. Old people were easy. They moved slow, thought slower, and usually gave up without a fight. Eddie the cook kept glancing over from his grill, some instinct telling him these weren't regular customers. His Navy training kicked in automatically: assess the threat, identify escape routes, protect the civilians. 3 young men, probably armed, definitely dangerous. Frank continued eating his eggs, unaware that he'd become the center of unwanted attention. The bronze star on his jacket told stories of courage under fire, of a young man who'd faced down armed enemies in Asian jungles. But that was a long time ago, and wars fought in foreign lands didn't prepare you for predators in your own neighborhood. Diner. The big man in the corner booth hadn't moved, but something had changed in his posture. The newspaper was still in his hands, but his eyes were tracking the 3 young men with the focus of someone who'd learned never to ignore his instincts. Derek finished his performance of drinking coffee and stood up, adjusting his jacket. The bulge near his waistband could have been anything, but it sent the message it was supposed to send. He was young, he was dangerous, and he was about to make his move. The diner held its breath as Derek started walking toward Frank's booth, each step deliberate and threatening. Betty grabbed the edge of the counter, knuckles white. Eddie's hand moved toward the knife block, muscle memory from a different kind of service. And in the corner booth, the newspaper crinkled as powerful hands gripped it just a little tighter. Derek slid into the booth across from Frank with the confidence of someone who'd never met real resistance. The vinyl seat creaked under his weight as he made himself comfortable, elbows on the table, invading the old man's space like he owned it. Frank looked up from his scrambled eggs, taking in the young man's expensive clothes and predatory smile. No fear showed in the veteran's weathered face. He'd seen worse things than punk kids in uniforms 60 years ago. "Morning, Pops," Derek said, his voice carrying false friendliness that fooled nobody. "Nice pins you got there. You serve Vietnam." Frank's response was measured, careful. "Long time ago." Derek's eyes cataloged everything like he was taking inventory. The watch, the wallet's outline in Frank's jacket, the way the old man's hands moved just a little slower than they used to. All weaknesses to be exploited. "My grandfather fought in that war," Derek lied smoothly. "Always said you guys got a raw deal coming home." He leaned forward, invading Frank's personal space. "That's a nice watch. Looks expensive." Frank's fingers instinctively covered the timepiece. Margaret's last gift to him before the cancer took her. 47 years of marriage distilled into gold and crystal, worth more for what it represented than what it cost. "It was my wife's," Frank said quietly. "Was." Derek's smile turned uglier. "Sorry for your loss, Pops. Must be lonely, eating breakfast by yourself every morning." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Derek had been watching, learning routines, identifying when Frank would be most vulnerable. This wasn't random. It was hunting. Betty started moving toward the booth, but Derek's eyes stopped her cold. The message was clear. Mind your own business or there'd be consequences. Frank straightened in his seat, military bearing asserting itself despite the circumstances. "Son, you don't want to do this. There are better ways." Derek laughed, the sound harsh in the diner's tense atmosphere. "Better ways to what, old man? I'm just having a conversation with a war hero." But his hand moved to his waistband, fingers touching something that made his jacket bulge. The universal gesture of young predators everywhere: comply or face the consequences. "Here's how this works," Derek continued, voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "You're going to give me that watch, your wallet, and whatever else you got. Nice and easy, no fuss. We walk away, you finish your eggs. Everybody's happy." Frank's jaw tightened, decades of pride and principle warring with the reality of his situation. He was 78 years old, alone, facing 3 young men who'd chosen violence as their first solution to any problem. "I fought for this country," Frank said softly. "Bled for it, lost friends for it, and I'm real grateful for your service." Derek mocked, reaching across the table. His fingers wrapped around Frank's wrist like a vice, applying just enough pressure to make the point. "Now hand over the goods before this gets unpleasant." The old man winced, but didn't cry out. Dignity was all he had left, and he wouldn't give these animals the satisfaction of seeing him broken. That's when the newspaper rustled from the corner booth. The sound was quiet, just paper being folded, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Derek's head turned, annoyance flickering across his face at the interruption that a deep voice, controlled and deadly calm, spoke into the silence. "You got 3 seconds to walk away." Derek turned his head to locate the source of that calm, dangerous voice. The words had carried absolute authority, the kind that made smart people step back and stupid people dig deeper holes. In the corner booth, a large black man was slowly folding his newspaper with deliberate care. Each crease was precise, methodical, like he was preparing for something that required his full attention. The simple movement somehow filled the entire diner with tension. Frank recognized something in the stranger's demeanor, the bearing of a warrior, the stillness that came before controlled violence. This wasn't some concerned citizen looking to play hero. This was something far more dangerous. "This ain't your business, old man," Derek snarled, but his grip on Frank's wrist loosened slightly. Some primitive instinct was telling him to be careful. Though his pride wouldn't let him listen, the stranger stood up with fluid grace, unfolding to his full height of 5'10". But it wasn't his size that made people take notice. It was the way he carried himself. Broad shoulders filled his black t-shirt, and his hands hung loose at his sides with the casual confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight that mattered. "Making it my business," the man said quietly. His voice carried decades of controlled violence, the sound of someone who'd hurt people professionally and might do it again if the situation called for it. Betty backed away from the counter, some survival instinct telling her to give these forces room to work. Derek tried to maintain his composure, but sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead. Marcus and TJ shifted nervously by the door, suddenly, less certain about their easy score. "I don't care who you think you are," Derek said, his voice cracking slightly. "This is between me and Grandpa here." The stranger took a step closer, moving with the balanced gait of a natural athlete. His presence seemed to expand with each footfall, filling the small diner like water finding its level. "Mike Tyson," he said simply, "and you just made the worst decision of your short life." The name hit the diner like a physical force. Several patrons gasped audibly. Chairs scraped as people either moved closer or backed away. Betty's hand flew to her mouth, and Eddie dropped his spatula with a metallic clatter that Frank's eyes widened with recognition and something approaching relief. He'd watched this man fight on television, had admired the controlled fury and devastating power. But seeing him in person was something else entirely. Like being in the presence of a barely contained natural disaster, Derek's face went through several rapid changes as his brain processed the information. Fear, disbelief, and finally a desperate kind of bravado as he realized backing down now would destroy his reputation on the streets. "Bullshit," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Mike Tyson's old, washed up. Probably can't fight his way out of a paper bag." Tyson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance. The casual stillness became something more focused, more predatory. His hands remained at his sides, but every line of his body suggested barely restrained violence. "Wrong. Dead legend, kid," Tyson said softly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Frank slowly moved his arm away from Derek's loosened grip, recognizing that he was about to witness something extraordinary and probably violent. Derek's hand moved toward his waistband, bravado overriding common sense. Around the diner, people held their breath, sensing they were about to see history made in the most unlikely of places. The name Mike Tyson electrified the small diner like lightning hitting water. Whispered conversations died instantly as the reality sank in. This wasn't just some concerned citizen. This was Iron Mike himself, the man who'd terrorized heavyweight divisions and become a living legend. "Holy shit, that's really him," someone whispered from a corner booth. "Iron Mike," Betty breathed, her voice mixing awe with concern for what was about to happen in her peaceful restaurant. Derek's swagger cracked visibly as he processed this information. His street reputation meant everything to him, but it was built on intimidating regular people, not facing down one of the most dangerous fighters in human history. Marcus and TJ exchanged panicked glances by the door. This wasn't part of any plan they'd agreed to. Robbing an old man was one thing. Tangling with a heavyweight legend was something else entirely. But Derek had painted himself into a corner. Too many people were watching, too much pride was on the line. Backing down now would destroy him in the neighborhood, make him a laughingstock among the crews that gave his life meaning. I don't care if you're Muhammad Ali's ghost, Derek said, his voice shaking slightly as he stood up from the booth. You're still just one old man. Tyson's response was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried more menace than all of Derek's posturing. Wrong dead legend, kid. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Frank had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who'd moved beyond fear into something colder and more focused. This young fool had no idea what he was about to face. That Derek's hand moved to his waistband again, fingers touching whatever gave him confidence in situations like this. But his movements were jerky now, desperate rather than smooth. The predator was becoming prey, and everyone in the diner could sense the shift. You want some of this, Iron Mike? Derek tried for his old arrogance, but it came out as bluster. Let's see what you got left in that old body. Tyson said nothing. He simply took another step forward, closing the distance between them with the measured pace of someone who'd done this dance countless times before. His hands still hung loose at his sides, but his shoulders had subtly shifted into fighting position. The diner had become a coliseum, every patron a witness to something that would become neighborhood legend. Eddie gripped his knife handle behind the counter, ready to help if needed. Betty reached for the phone, then stopped, recognizing that this would be over before the police could arrive. Frank pressed back into his booth, giving the warriors room to work. He'd seen combat, but this was different. Two very different kinds of violence about to collide in spectacular fashion. Derek threw his shoulders back, trying to recapture some of his earlier confidence. He was young, strong, probably armed. Against most people, that would be enough. Against Mike Tyson, it was like bringing a knife to a nuclear war. Come on then, old man, Derek taunted, raising his fists in what he probably thought was a fighting stance. Show me what made you famous. Tyson's eyes never left Derek's face, reading him like a book written in a language of violence only he could fully understand. The young man was already beaten. He just didn't know it yet. Last chance, Tyson said quietly. Walk away. Derek's response was to square his stance and throw a wild, overhand right that telegraphed itself from Brooklyn to Manhattan. It was the punch of someone who'd won fights against regular people through aggression and surprise. Not skilled at IT was also the last mistake Derek would make for a very long time. Derek's punch came fast, but sloppy. A wild right hook thrown with street fighting fury and no technique. Against most opponents, it might have connected. Against Mike Tyson, it was like swinging at smoke. Tyson's head moved exactly 6 inches to the left, a movement so subtle and precise that the punch whistled harmlessly past his ear. 50 years of training had compressed into that single, perfect, defensive action. What followed lasted exactly 2.3 seconds, though everyone who witnessed it would remember it in slow motion for the rest of their lives. Tyson's counter was everything Derek's punch wasn't: short, precise, and devastatingly powerful. His right hand traveled maybe 8 inches, rising from his hip in a compact uppercut that carried the accumulated force of decades of perfect technique. The punch landed flush on Derek's chin with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a side of beef. Derek's head snapped back violently, his eyes rolling back as his legs turned to water beneath him. He was unconscious before gravity took hold, crumpling to the diner floor like a marionette with cut strings, the sound of Derek's body hitting the linoleum echoed in the sudden, absolute silence. Marcus and TJ, seeing their invincible leader destroyed in a single punch, scrambled for the door like their lives depended on it. TJ stumbled over a chair in his panic, Marcus practically climbing over his back to reach the exit first. They burst through the door and disappeared into Brooklyn's streets, leaving their fallen leader behind without a second thought. Tyson stood over Derek's motionless form, flexing his right hand once to check for damage. There was none. The punch had been technically perfect, delivered with just enough force to end the threat without causing permanent harm. Old habits died hard, even in self-defense. The diner remained frozen for a heartbeat longer, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. Then Betty started clapping, her hands coming together in sharp, appreciative applause. The sound broke the spell. The entire restaurant erupted in cheers and applause, patrons standing at their tables to show appreciation for justice delivered with devastating efficiency. Damn. Eddie called from behind the grill, his voice filled with professional admiration. That was beautiful work. Tyson ignored the celebration, his attention focused on Frank. He extended the same hand that had just rendered Derek unconscious, offering it to help the elderly veteran stand. "You okay, soldier?" Tyson asked quietly. Frank took the offered hand, surprised by the gentleness in Tyson's grip. For all his legendary power, the man helped him up with the care someone might use with fragile china. "Thanks to you," Frank replied, his voice thick with gratitude and emotion. That was something to see. Derek lay motionless on the floor, breathing but thoroughly unconscious. A small trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth, but otherwise he looked almost peaceful. The violence had been swift and decisive, surgical in its precision. Tyson looked down at the fallen young man with something that might have been pity. "Some kids got to learn the hard way," he said softly. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Someone had called the police despite the speed of the confrontation. Betty bustled over with ice wrapped in a towel, though Tyson waved it away. His knuckles showed no sign of impact, no swelling or discoloration. 40 years of throwing punches, he explained to Frank with a slight smile. "You learn how to do it without hurting yourself." Frank straightened his jacket and checked his watch, still intact, still ticking. Margaret's final gift had survived another day, protected by an unlikely guardian who'd appeared exactly when needed. The legend of Brooklyn had just added another chapter, written in violence and finished with justice. The sirens grew louder as NYPD units converged on Rosie's diner, their red and blue lights painting the morning in urgent colors. Derek remained unconscious on the linoleum floor, his breathing steady but his dreams probably filled with exploding stars. Detective Rosa Martinez was first through the door, her experienced eyes immediately taking in the scene. One man down. No visible weapons, and what appeared to be a very calm Mike Tyson sitting in a booth next to an elderly veteran. She'd been a cop long enough to read situations quickly. "Anybody hurt?" she asked, though the question was mostly procedural. "Just his pride," Betty called from behind the counter, pointing at Derek. "And maybe his jaw." Martinez approached Tyson with the careful respect of someone who knew exactly who she was dealing with. "Mr. Tyson, I'm Detective Martinez. Can you tell me what happened here?" "Kid attacked the old man," Tyson said simply, nodding toward Frank. "I stopped him." The witnesses were eager to tell their version. Derek had been threatening Frank, demanding money and personal property. Tyson had warned him to leave. Derek threw the first punch, and justice was served with scientific precision. "Self-defense of another," Martinez noted, writing in her pad. "Clean and simple." EMTs checked Derek for serious injury, but found only a bruised jaw and wounded dignity. As they helped him to his feet, his eyes found Tyson across the diner, widening with the memory of what had just happened to him. "That's assault." Derek slurred through his swollen mouth. "I want to press charges." Martinez looked at him with the expression cops reserve for particularly stupid criminals. "Son, you attacked an elderly veteran in front of a dozen witnesses. You threw the first punch at Mr. Tyson. The only charges being filed are against you." As Derek was led away in handcuffs, muttering threats and promises of revenge, Frank moved closer to Tyson. The danger was over, but something else was just beginning. "I need to tell you something," Frank said quietly. "This wasn't random. This is the fourth time this month they've come after one of us." Tyson's expression darkened. "Us, veterans," Frank explained. "Tony Moretti last week, Purple Heart recipient, lives alone in Bensonhurst. They knew exactly when he picked up his prescription money. Bobby Chin 2 weeks ago, right outside the VA hospital. They knew his routine, his schedule." Frank pulled out a small notebook, pages filled with careful handwriting. "I've been tracking it. Same pattern every time. Young men who know exactly who we are, what we carry, when we're most vulnerable. Inside information," Tyson said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Has to be. Someone with access to veteran records is feeding them targets. Our addresses, our benefit schedules, even which pharmacy we use for prescriptions." The implications hit Tyson like a physical blow. This wasn't just random street crime. This was systematic hunting of American heroes, men who'd bled for their country only to be betrayed by it in their golden years. Detective Martinez finished her paperwork and approached them. Frank, you mentioned this has happened before? Fourth time, Frank confirmed. I've tried reporting it, but nobody connects the dots. Martinez finished grimly. Different precincts, different investigating officers. The pattern gets lost. Frank closed his notebook and looked directly at Tyson. There's something else you should know. About why I knew help was coming when I saw you stand up. Tyson waited, sensing something important coming. Your trainer, Cuz D'Amato, Frank said softly. We served together in Korea. He saved my life. Carried me out under enemy fire when I took shrapnel in my leg. The words hit Tyson harder than Derek's punch ever could have. Cuz had never mentioned Korea, never talked about his military service. But knowing his mentor had been a hero long before he'd trained champions somehow made perfect sense. He never said anything. Tyson said quietly. Frank smiled sadly. Cuz never talked about the war. But he taught you to be a protector, didn't he? To use your strength for the right reasons. Tyson nodded, understanding flooding through him. The old man he'd just defended wasn't a stranger. He was family, connected through bonds forged in combat and tempered in a boxing gym in Catskill. These punks are hunting the wrong soldiers, Tyson said, his voice carrying quiet menace. Frank extended his hand, and Tyson took it firmly. 2 generations of warriors, bound by respect and shared purpose. Welcome to the war, son, Frank said. Outside Rosie's diner, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Brooklyn sidewalk as Tyson struggled to process Frank's revelation. Cuz D'Amato, the man who'd saved him from the streets and taught him to channel rage into discipline, had been a war hero who'd never spoken of his service. Frank waited patiently beside the diner's entrance, understanding that some news needed time to settle. The old veteran had carried this knowledge for decades, watching Tyson's career from afar and knowing that Cuz's lessons had created more than just a champion. They'd forged a protector. You said he saved your life, Tyson said finally. Hill 347, outside Seoul, Frank replied. Chinese forces had us pinned down for 6 hours. I took shrapnel in my leg, couldn't move. Cuz crawled 50 yards under machine gun fire to reach me, then carried me back to safety. The image of his mentor as a young soldier, risking everything for a fallen comrade, filled gaps in Tyson's understanding that he hadn't even known existed. Cuz had taught him that strength without purpose was just violence. But now he understood where that wisdom came from. Let me give you a ride home, Tyson offered. I want to hear more about this pattern you've been tracking. Frank's apartment was a 15-minute walk from the diner, but the old veteran was grateful for the offer. His leg always ached more after stress, and facing down armed robbers qualified as stressful. Even with Iron Mike as backup, the building was modest but well-maintained, the kind of place where working-class families had raised children and grown old with dignity. Frank's third-floor apartment told the story of a life lived with honor. Purple Heart displayed on the mantel, photos of fellow soldiers who'd made it home and too many who hadn't. Coffee? Frank asked, moving with practiced efficiency around his small kitchen. Please. Tyson examined the wall of military memorabilia, each piece representing moments of courage that most people could never imagine. Frank prepared coffee with the ceremony of someone who'd learned precision in the army and never forgot it. Equal measures, proper temperature, attention to detail that showed respect for both the process and the guest. Tell me about these other attacks, Tyson said. Accepting a steaming mug, Frank retrieved his notebook from a drawer, pages filled with careful observations written in the block letters taught to Army clerks 60 years ago. Tony Moretti, 72, Purple Heart, from Da Nang. Lives alone since his wife passed. They hit him last Tuesday, right after his monthly VA appointment. He flipped to another page. Bobby Chun, 75, Korean War veteran. Attacked outside the VA hospital after picking up prescriptions. Same crew. 3 young men who knew exactly when he'd be carrying cash. Tyson studied the notes, seeing patterns emerge from Frank's meticulous documentation. Times, locations, victim profiles, all pointing to systematic hunting rather than random crime. They knew Tony gets his prescription money on the first Tuesday of every month, Frank continued. They knew Bobby always parks in the same spot, walks the same route. Information like that doesn't come from watching. It comes from records. VA records, Tyson said grimly. Frank nodded. Someone with access to veteran information is selling us out. Names, addresses, benefit schedules, medical appointments. Everything a predator would need to plan the perfect crime. The betrayal. Cut deep. These men had served their country with honor, earned the right to grow old with dignity and security. Instead, they were being hunted by the very system meant to protect them. How many more? Tyson asked. Frank turned to a page near the back of his notebook. 12 confirmed attacks in 6 weeks. All veterans, all targeted with inside information. I've been trying to warn the others, but there are hundreds of us in this area alone. Tyson set down his coffee cup with careful control. Then we need help. Someone who understands how this system works. Frank smiled for the first time since the diner. I know just the person. The next morning found Tyson and Frank making their way through Brooklyn's neighborhoods, following addresses from Frank's carefully maintained list. Their first stop was Tony Moretti's apartment in Bensonhurst, a tidy one-bedroom in a building that had seen better decades. Tony answered his door with caution that spoke of recent trauma. The 72-year-old veteran still showed signs of his encounter with Derek's crew, a healing black eye, and his left arm in a sling. But his spine straightened when he recognized Frank, and his eyes widened with amazement when he realized who accompanied him. Frank told me you might come by, Tony said, stepping aside to let them in. Mr. Tyson, it's an honor. The apartment showed signs of struggle, an overturned end table that hadn't been properly straightened, picture frames with cracks in the glass, the lingering atmosphere of violence in a space meant for peace. Tell us what happened, Frank said gently. Tony's story matched the pattern exactly. 3 young men, mid-20s, who'd known his routine better than his own neighbors. They'd waited for him outside the pharmacy where he picked up his prescription, cash every month, knowing exactly when and where he'd be most vulnerable. They knew I'd have $400, Tony said, unconsciously touching his injured shoulder. Knew I always park in the back lot, always use the side entrance. Information like that comes from inside. Tyson finished. Their second visit was to Bobby Chun in Sunset Park, a Korean War veteran whose dignity remained intact despite the trauma he'd endured. Bobby's attack had been even more brazen, right outside the VA Medical Center, in broad daylight, with security cameras recording everything. They didn't care about witnesses, Bobby explained, serving tea in cups that shook slightly in his weathered hands. Acted like they owned the place, like they knew nobody would stop them. The attackers had known Bobby's schedule down to the minute, which entrance he used, where he parked his car, even that he carried extra cash on prescription. Days to help other veterans who came up short at the pharmacy. They took $800, Bobby said quietly. But worse than that, they took my father's watch. Brought it with him from Seoul in 1953, gave it to me when he died. Tyson's jaw tightened at the casual cruelty of stealing irreplaceable memories along with money. Their third stop confirmed the pattern beyond any doubt. William Red Sullivan, 81, World War II veteran attacked in his own apartment building's lobby. Same crew, same inside knowledge, same systematic targeting of vulnerability. They knew I'd just been to the bank, Red said, his voice still strong despite his age. Knew which day I always go, which teller I prefer. Even knew about the emergency cash I keep in my jacket pocket. By noon, the scope of the conspiracy was undeniable. 12 veterans, systematically hunted using information that could only come from official records. Someone with legitimate access was selling American heroes to street predators. In Frank's car after the third interview, Tyson's anger was building like pressure in a boiler. These weren't random crimes. They were betrayals of the highest order, targeting men who'd already sacrificed everything for their country. It's not just robbery, Frank said, reading Tyson's expression. It's psychological warfare, making us afraid in our own neighborhoods, destroying our sense of security. Who has access to this kind of information? Tyson asked. VA employees, social workers, medical staff, Frank replied. Could be dozens of people, maybe hundreds. But I know someone who's been tracking this from the inside. Frank started the car, heading toward downtown Brooklyn. Margaret Sullivan. She's a social worker at the VA Medical Center, been trying to get official attention for weeks. If anyone can help us identify the source, it's her. Tyson stared out the window at the neighborhood where he'd grown up, now seeing it through different eyes. The elderly man walking slowly with a cane, the veteran with service pins on his jacket, the old woman counting change at the bus stop. All potential targets in a war they didn't even know was being fought. These kids think they're hunting sheep, Tyson said quietly. Frank glanced over at him, seeing the transformation from concerned citizen to something far more dangerous. What do you see when you look at them? Wolves, Tyson replied. But they picked the wrong flock. Time they learned. What happens when you mess with people under my protection? The car turned toward the VA medical center, carrying 2 generations of warriors toward answers and justice. The Brooklyn VA Medical Center rose from the urban landscape like a monument to service and sacrifice, its institutional architecture softened by the American flags that flew at every entrance. Frank led Tyson through familiar corridors, past waiting rooms filled with men and women who'd answered their country's call in conflicts spanning 8 decades. Margaret Sullivan's office was tucked away on the 3rd floor, a cramped space that somehow managed to feel warm despite the government-issued furniture and fluorescent lighting. The walls told the story of her dedication, certificates of appreciation from veteran organizations, photos of retirement parties and memorial services, a small American flag on her desk. Margaret herself was 52 years old with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much bureaucratic indifference to genuine suffering. When Frank knocked on her open door, her face lit up with relief and concern. "Frank, thank God you're okay," she said, rising from her desk. "I heard about what happened at the diner." "Margaret, this is Mike Tyson," Frank said simply. To Margaret's professional composure cracked for just a moment. "The Mike Tyson? Mr. Tyson, it's an honor. And thank you for protecting Frank." "Call me Mike," Tyson replied, shaking her hand. Gently. "Frank tells me you've been tracking these attacks." Margaret's office wall was covered with what looked like a detective's investigation board. Incident reports, victim photos, a map of Brooklyn with red pins marking attack locations. Strings connected various elements, creating a web that spoke of systematic analysis and growing alarm. 12 confirmed attacks in 6 weeks, Margaret began, pointing to the map. All targeting veterans with predictable benefit schedules. The pattern is unmistakable. Someone with access to our databases is selling information. She pulled Derek's arrest photo from a file, clipping it to the board. This young man was arrested 6 months ago for similar crimes, but the charges were mysteriously dropped. Community service at a local outreach center instead of jail time. Someone's protecting them, Tyson observed. "More than that," Margaret replied, opening her computer. "I've been digging into the database access logs. Look at this." The screen showed a pattern of unusual activity, veteran records being accessed outside normal business hours, searches that didn't match any legitimate casework, a systematic review of benefit payment schedules. "Whoever's doing this has high-level access," Margaret explained. "Not just basic patient information, but financial records, appointment schedules, even family contact information." Frank studied the data over her shoulder. "How many people have this kind of access? In this office? Maybe 15. Citywide. Across all VA facilities? Could be hundreds." She pulled up another screen showing financial records. But there's something else. Several of the victims had recent changes to their benefit processing, small adjustments that would affect when and where they receive payments. "Creating better targets," Tyson said grimly. "Exactly. Someone's not just stealing information. They're manipulating the system to make these men more vulnerable." Margaret opened a locked drawer and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been documenting everything unofficially because my supervisors keep telling me it's just random crime. But I think I know who's behind it." She placed a personnel photo on the desk. Dr. Patricia Holloway, Assistant Director of Veterans Benefits Administration. An attractive woman in her 50s with auburn hair and intelligent eyes that somehow managed to look cold even in an official photograph. Dr. Holloway has unlimited database access, authority to modify benefit schedules, and the political connections to make problems disappear, Margaret explained. She's also been living well above her government salary for the past 2 years. Frank leaned forward, studying the photo. "You think she's selling us out?" "I think she's running the whole operation. The street crews are just the visible part, muscle for hire. The real crime is happening right here, in our own computer systems." Tyson felt familiar anger building in his chest, the controlled fury that had powered his greatest victories. But this was different from anything he'd faced in the ring. This was betrayal of the most sacred kind. The very people trusted to protect veterans were hunting them instead. What do we need to prove? He asked. Margaret smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. Evidence of her accessing records that don't match her legitimate cases. Financial proof of payments from outside sources. And testimony from someone inside her network who's willing to talk. Derek, Frank said. Derek, Tyson agreed. Kids looking at serious time. Might be willing to trade information for a better deal. Margaret began gathering files. I'll start building the official case from this end. But you two need to be careful if I'm right about Dr. Holloway. She has resources and connections that go way beyond street criminals. As they prepared to leave, Margaret touched Frank's arm gently. There's something else. I've identified potential targets for the next wave of attacks. Veterans who fit the profile, have upcoming benefit payments, live alone. She handed him a list of names and addresses. Warn them if you can. But remember, if we're right about this conspiracy, the people hunting them have access to everything we know. Tyson folded the list carefully, committing the names to memory. Then we better move fast. Outside the medical center, Frank looked up at the building that was supposed to represent America's gratitude to its veterans. Hard to believe our own people would sell us out. Some people, Tyson corrected. Margaret's one of ours too, and she's fighting back. Frank nodded, understanding the distinction. So what's our next move? Tyson pulled out his phone, dialing Detective Martinez's number. We find out where Derek was supposed to be doing his community service. Time to have a conversation with whoever's been protecting him. The war was expanding beyond the streets now, reaching into the institutions that shaped their community. But Tyson had spent his life fighting opponents who seemed unbeatable, and he'd learned that the bigger they were, the harder they fell. The Brooklyn Community Outreach Center sat on Nostrand Avenue like a beacon of hope in a neighborhood that had seen too little of it. Fresh paint covered the brick walls, and colorful murals depicted scenes of unity and progress. Children's laughter echoed from the basketball court behind the building, where teenagers played pickup games under the afternoon sun. From their vantage point across the street, Tyson and Frank surveilled the facility that was supposed to be reforming young criminals like Derek. On the surface, it looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a place where second chances became new beginnings. But Tyson's experience caught details that didn't fit. Too many young men in expensive clothes for a poverty-stricken neighborhood. Cars that cost more than most people's annual salary parked casually at the curb. Quick visits that lasted just long enough to exchange something small enough to fit in a palm. That's not community service, Frank observed, watching a teenager emerge from the center and drive away in a BMW that probably cost $60,000. That's business, Tyson agreed. Through Margaret's contacts, they'd learned that the center was run by Vinny Castellano, a second-generation criminal who'd inherited his father's protection rackets and expanded them into more modern enterprises. On paper, he was a reformed gangster using his street credibility to help at-risk youth. In reality, he was something far more dangerous. Frank pulled out a small pair of binoculars, military surplus from his army days, and focused on the building's entrance. His reconnaissance training kicked in automatically, cataloging patterns and personnel with the precision of a soldier preparing for battle. 6 regulars so far, he reported quietly. Ages roughly 20 to 30, all carrying themselves like they've been in fights. 2 are definitely armed, shoulder holsters under their jackets. Tyson memorized each face as Frank described them. Derek's crew had been amateurs, kids playing at being tough guys. These looked like professionals, the kind of muscle that's successful. Criminals kept on payroll. A black BMW pulled up to the curb, and Frank adjusted his focus. Here comes the boss. Vincent Castellano emerged from the passenger seat like he owned the entire block. Late 40s, expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, gold jewelry catching the afternoon light. He moved with the confident swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Connected guy, Tyson observed, noting the deference shown by everyone around Castellano. Old-school family, but smart enough to evolve with the times. They watched as Castellano conducted what appeared to be legitimate business, shaking hands with community members, patting children on the head, playing the role of neighborhood benefactor. But his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging threats and opportunities with predatory awareness. He's good, Frank admitted grudgingly. If I didn't know better, I'd think he was actually trying to help people. That's what made Castellano dangerous, the ability to project respectability while orchestrating violence. Derek and his crew were expendable foot soldiers, easily replaced if they got caught or killed. But the man giving orders had built himself layers of protection that would make him nearly untouchable through normal legal channels that a delivery van pulled up, and two men began unloading boxes marked as sports equipment. But the way they handled the containers suggested contents more valuable than basketballs and sneakers. Money, Frank wondered. Or product, Tyson replied. Could be running multiple operations out of the same location. Through the binoculars, Frank watched as Castellano directed the unloading with casual authority. The man clearly knew how to compartmentalize his business, legitimate community programs providing cover for criminal enterprise. Military precision, Frank noted with professional appreciation. Someone taught him how to run an operation. A familiar figure emerged from the building. Marcus, one of Derek's crew members who'd fled from the diner. He approached Castellano with obvious nervousness, hands gesturing as he apparently delivered a report. Castellano's expression darkened as he listened. Even from across the street, his anger was visible in the sharp movements of his hands, the aggressive set of his shoulders. Bad news travels fast, Tyson observed. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Castellano something on the screen, probably video from the diner incident. Castellano grabbed the phone, studying it intently before handing it back with what appeared to be specific instructions. They know about you, Frank said quietly. Good, Tyson replied. Saves me the trouble of introducing myself. Castellano disappeared back into the building, but the activity around the center increased noticeably. More cars arrived, more personnel appeared, the casual atmosphere replaced by something more focused and dangerous. Frank lowered the binoculars and looked at Tyson. We've found the source. Question is, what do we do about it? Tyson studied the building that masqueraded as hope while dealing in predation. Somewhere inside, plans were being made to continue hunting American veterans. Strategies were being developed to turn heroes into victims. We shut them down, he said simply. Frank understood the implications. This wasn't just about Derek anymore, or even about the robbery attempts. This was about declaring war on an organization that had declared war on them first. It won't be like the diner, Frank warned. These aren't kids playing at being tough. They're professionals. Tyson's smile was cold and familiar, the expression that had terrified heavyweight contenders for 2 decades. So am I. That evening, Tyson and Frank returned to Nostrand Avenue as shadows lengthened across the Brooklyn streets. The community outreach center looked different after dark, the cheerful facade stripped away to reveal something harder and more predatory underneath. The legitimate programs had ended with daylight. No more children's laughter, no more basketball games, no more community meetings about neighborhood improvement. Instead, the building hummed with a different kind of activity entirely. Frank positioned himself in the doorway of a closed barbershop, his military training allowing him to blend into urban shadows like he'd once disappeared into Vietnamese jungle. From this vantage point, he could observe the center's main entrance and document everything with the precision of a soldier gathering intelligence. Tyson took up position in an alley that provided a clear view of the building's rear exit, his street knowledge helping him identify escape routes and defensive positions. Together, they formed a surveillance net that would have impressed professional law enforcement. The transformation was remarkable. As soon as the last legitimate visitor left, Castellano's real business began. Cars arrived at regular intervals, expensive vehicles driven by young men who clearly weren't there for job training or community service. Through his binoculars, Frank counted 12 regular crew members, mapping their hierarchy and responsibilities. With methodical care, Castellano commanded from the center like a general directing troops, his authority absolute and unquestioned. Money changed hands with industrial efficiency. Envelopes were distributed along with what appeared to be assignment sheets, target lists containing names, addresses, and detailed personal information. Jesus, Frank whispered into his phone, maintaining contact with Tyson. They're running this like a military operation. From his position, Tyson could see the scope expanding beyond simple robbery. Through an open window, he observed computers displaying what looked like benefit applications, medical records, and financial documents. This wasn't just theft. It was comprehensive fraud targeting the veteran community on multiple levels. Marcus emerged from the building carrying a manila folder thick with documents. Behind him came TJ, now sporting a bruised face from his encounter with the diner's back door during his panicked escape. Both young men moved with the nervous energy of soldiers preparing for battle. Castellano appeared in the doorway, pointing at specific locations on what appeared to be a neighborhood map. His instructions were too quiet to hear, but his gestures suggested systematic coverage of targeted areas that Frank's phone vibrated with a text from Margaret. Database accessed again tonight. 15 new veteran profiles pulled, all living alone, all with upcoming benefit payments. The intelligence confirmed what they were witnessing: a criminal enterprise operating with insider information to maximize efficiency and minimize risk. Somewhere in that building were files containing the names and vulnerabilities of dozens of American heroes that a delivery truck arrived at the rear entrance, and Tyson watched as boxes were unloaded with suspicious care. The contents could have been anything, but the reverent handling suggested either large amounts of cash or sensitive documents. Identity theft operation, Tyson realized, calling Frank. They're not just robbing veterans, they're stealing their entire lives. Frank's military mind immediately grasped the implications. Medical records, benefit information, personal history. Everything you'd need to assume someone's identity and drain their accounts. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. These weren't street criminals grabbing quick cash. They were sophisticated predators systematically destroying the lives of men who'd already sacrificed everything for their country. The Castellano's phone rang, and his conversation became animated, gesturing aggressively as he spoke. Even from a distance, his anger was apparent. "Trouble in paradise," Frank observed. The call ended, and Castellano immediately began issuing orders. Crew members scattered to various positions around the building, taking defensive postures that spoke of military or paramilitary training. That Frank's blood chilled as he realized what was happening. "They know we're here." Across the street, Tyson had reached the same conclusion. Movement in the building had shifted from business to preparation, and too many eyes were now scanning the surrounding area with professional awareness. "Time to go," Tyson said quietly. They withdrew separately, using different routes to avoid detection. But as Frank limped away from his surveillance position, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been discovered not through carelessness, but through betrayal. Someone had told Castellano they were coming to Frank's temporary apartment, felt smaller with Mike Tyson sitting at the kitchen table, both men nursing coffee that had grown cold while they processed the scope of what they discovered. The wall clock showed nearly midnight, but sleep seemed impossible with the weight of conspiracy pressing down on them. "It's bigger than we thought," Frank said, breaking the silence. "Identity theft, benefits fraud, systematic targeting. This isn't just robbery, it's warfare against every veteran in Brooklyn." Tyson studied the notes Frank had taken during their surveillance, each page documenting another layer of betrayal. Castellano's got resources, connections, inside information. Taking him down won't be simple. Frank reached into a drawer and pulled out something wrapped in faded cloth. Inside was a photograph, black and white, showing two young soldiers in Korean war uniforms. One was clearly Frank, decades younger but with the same determined eyes. The other was a face Tyson recognized from countless hours in the gym, though he'd never seen Cuz D'Amato in military dress. "I've been carrying this for 60 years, Frank said quietly. "Never showed it to anyone, not even my wife. But I think you need to see it." Tyson took the photograph with reverent hands, studying his mentor's face. Cuz looked impossibly young, but his eyes carried the same intensity that had later shaped champions. "Hill 347, Frank continued. "We've been pinned down for 6 hours by Chinese machine gun nests. I was hit in the leg, couldn't move without drawing fire. The smart play was to leave me and save the rest of the squad." Frank poured fresh coffee, his movements careful and deliberate. But Cuz wasn't smart that way. He was righteous. Crawled 50 yards through open ground with bullets cutting the air around him. Reached my position and threw me over his shoulder like I weighed nothing. The story painted a picture of heroism that Tyson had never heard. though it perfectly matched the character of the man who'd saved him from Brooklyn's streets decades later. Carried me back to our lines under fire, Frank said. Saved my life. But he never talked about it afterward. When I tried to thank him, he just said, "We look after our own." Tyson felt the weight of inherited responsibility settling on his shoulders. The connection between Frank and Cuz wasn't coincidence. It was continuation of a brotherhood that transcended generations. I followed your career, Frank admitted. Every fight, every victory. Knew that Cuz had passed on more than boxing technique. He'd taught you to be a protector. He used to say that boxing was just the tool. Tyson remembered. The real fight was about standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Frank nodded. That's why I knew help was coming when I saw you stand up in that diner. Cuz trained warriors, not just fighters. The photograph bridged decades and connected two very different conflicts, a war fought in Asian mountains and a battle waged in Brooklyn streets. But the principles remained constant. Protect the innocent, stand against evil, never abandon your brothers. There's something else, Frank said, pulling out a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a military medal Tyson didn't recognize. Cuz Silver Star, Frank explained. For extraordinary gallantry in action. He gave it to me before. We shipped home, said he didn't need medals to remember what happened on that hill. Tyson's phone rang, cutting through the emotional weight of the moment. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and her voice was tight with urgency when he answered. Mike, we have a problem. Database activity spiked an hour ago. Someone pulled files on 23 veterans, all with benefit payments scheduled. For tomorrow. Tomorrow? Frank asked, overhearing. Monthly VA group therapy session at the Senior Center on Atlantic Avenue. Margaret continued. Dr. Holloway knows exactly when and where vulnerable veterans will be gathering with cash for their prescriptions. The implications hit them both simultaneously. While they'd been watching Castellano's operation, a much larger attack was being planned. 23 potential victims, all gathering in one location, all carrying the money they'd need for monthly medications. It's a setup, Tyson realized. Mass robbery disguised as coincidence. Frank was already reaching for his jacket. We have to warn them. There's more, Margaret said grimly. I tried to contact Dr. Holloway to report suspicious database activity. Her assistant says she left early today, personal emergency. No. Forwarding information, no expected return date. She's running, Frank said. Or escalating. Tyson corrected. Either way, tomorrow's going to be bloody if we don't stop it. Frank carefully returned Cuz's photograph and medal to their resting place. But something had changed in his demeanor. The elderly veteran was being replaced by the soldier who'd survived foreign wars and earned his country's highest honors. One more mission, he said quietly. For Cuz. For all the boys who didn't make it home. Tyson stood, feeling the weight of legacy and responsibility. Tomorrow would test everything his mentor had taught him about using strength to protect the weak. But tonight, he had work to do. The next afternoon, Tyson walked through the front door of the Brooklyn Community Outreach Center like he owned the place. No stealth, no surveillance. Just Iron Mike announcing his presence to everyone inside. The main room fell silent as his shadow filled the doorway. 6 of Castellano's crew members were present, including Marcus and TJ from the diner incident. All conversation stopped as they recognized the man who'd put their leader in the hospital with a single punch. Where's your boss? Tyson asked conversationally, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone who'd never been denied an answer. Marcus stepped forward, trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. Vinny ain't here, and you ain't welcome. Tyson smiled, the expression holding about as much warmth as a winter grave. That's okay. I came to see you boys anyway. The crew members exchanged nervous glances, suddenly realizing they were trapped in an enclosed space with possibly the most dangerous man on the planet. The back exit was blocked by overturned furniture. Castellano's paranoia about law enforcement raids had created their prison. Derek sent a message from lockup. Tyson continued, stepping further into the room. Says you boys been hunting the wrong prey. TJ pulled a baseball bat from behind the counter, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the handle. We ain't afraid of you, old man. You should be, Tyson said simply. Marcus made the first mistake, swinging a wild haymaker that telegraphed itself from Manhattan. Tyson's defensive movement was minimal, a slight duck that left Marcus overextended and vulnerable. The counterpunch was devastating. A perfect left hook to the body that dropped Marcus like he'd been shot. TJ came next with his baseball bat, swinging for Tyson's head with desperate fury. But Tyson had been dodging weapons since he was 12 years old on Brooklyn's streets. He stepped inside the arc, caught TJ's wrist, and twisted. The bat clattered to the floor as TJ screamed. His arm bent at an angle that suggested serious damage to his elbow joint. 4 crew members remained, and they rushed him simultaneously, the smart tactical move that might have worked against most opponents. Against Mike Tyson, it was suicide. His first combination dropped 2 men before they knew what hit them. A right uppercut that lifted one clear off his feet, followed by a left hook that sent the other spinning into the wall. The third man managed to land a glancing blow to Tyson's ribs, but the counter was immediate and final. A short right hand that put him down for the count. The last crew member, showing more intelligence than courage, raised his hands in surrender. "Smart choice," Tyson said, breathing only slightly harder than normal. The entire fight had lasted maybe 30 seconds. 6 professional criminals, some armed, all younger and desperate, reduced to groaning wreckage by a man old enough to be there. "Father." Tyson stepped over the bodies and walked to Castellano's office, finding it unlocked but empty. The crime boss had fled, probably warned by lookouts who'd seen Tyson approaching. But in his haste, Castellano had left behind something more valuable than his presence. Files covered the desk, veteran records printed from VA databases, target lists with names and addresses, payment schedules that matched Margaret's warnings exactly. Everything needed to prove the conspiracy, except for the man giving orders. Most interesting was a business card tucked into the corner of one file. Dr. Patricia Holloway, Assistant Director, Veterans Benefits Administration. On the back, written, in feminine handwriting, "The Boss." Tyson pocketed the card and gathered the most damaging documents. Outside, sirens wailed. Someone had called the police, probably neighbors who'd heard the brief but intense violence. He walked back through the main room, stepping carefully around the scattered crew members. Most were unconscious, but Marcus was stirring, trying to sit up despite his obvious injuries. "Tell your boss I'm coming for him," Tyson said quietly. "And tell Dr. Holloway that hunting season is over." Marcus nodded weakly, understanding that. He'd just received a message worth more than his life. Detective Martinez arrived as Tyson reached the sidewalk, her expression mixing professional duty with personal respect. "Self-defense again?" she asked, surveying the damage visible through the open door. "They drew first," Tyson confirmed. "Found this on the premises." He handed her the files, watching her eyes widen as she processed the implications. Veteran records, target lists, evidence of systematic fraud, everything needed to build a federal case. "This goes way beyond street crime," Martinez said. "Way beyond," Tyson agreed, "but not beyond justice." As EMTs attended to Castellano's crew, Tyson felt satisfaction at another victory. But this war was far from over. Castellano had escaped. Dr. Holloway remained at large, and somewhere out there, American veterans were still being hunted. Time to end this. The Frank's temporary apartment buzzed with celebration as word spread through Brooklyn's veteran community about Tyson's raid on the community center. Margaret had arrived with pizza and beer, her professional composure cracking into genuine joy as she reviewed the recovered files. "This is everything we need for federal charges," she said, spreading documents across Frank's kitchen table. "Victim lists, database printouts, evidence of systematic fraud. The whole operation's blown wide open." Bobby Chun and Tony Moretti had joined the impromptu party, along with 3 other veterans who'd survived attacks from Castellano's crew. The apartment felt warm for the first time since Frank's building had burned, filled with the kind of brotherhood that only came from shared struggle and victory. 6 men, Tony marveled, shaking his head as he studied police reports from the scene. Mike took down 6 armed men in 30 seconds. "Like the old days," Bobby added with obvious admiration, "when champions were warriors, not just athletes." Tyson sat quietly in the corner, accepting congratulations with characteristic modesty. The physical confrontation had been satisfying, but he knew the real victory belonged to Margaret and her methodical investigation. "Castellano's crew is talking," Detective Martinez reported over the phone, her voice crackling through Frank's speaker. Facing serious time, they're giving up everything. The database contact, the money laundering, even Dr. Holloway's direct involvement. Frank raised his beer in a toast. To Mike Tyson, protector of Brooklyn's finest. The room erupted in cheers and applause. For the first time in weeks, the gathered veterans felt safe in their own neighborhood. The systematic hunting was over, the predators were in custody, and their community could return to normal. Margaret pulled Tyson aside as the celebration continued. You know this goes beyond Brooklyn, right? These files show similar operations. In Queens, Manhattan, even Staten Island. You've started something that's going to help thousands of veterans. Just doing what needed doing, Tyson replied. Cuz would be proud, Frank said, overhearing. Standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. The evening stretched on with war stories and shared memories, the apartment filled with laughter and the deep satisfaction of justice served. Even Eddie from the diner had stopped by, bringing coffee and sandwiches for the impromptu gathering at by 10 p.m. The party was winding down. The elderly veterans were heading home to comfortable beds and peaceful sleep, secure in the knowledge that their neighborhood was safe again. Margaret gathered her files, preparing comprehensive reports that would reach federal investigators by morning. This is going to make headlines, she predicted. Former heavyweight champion saves Brooklyn veterans from criminal conspiracy. Better keep my name out of it, Tyson said. This was about them, not me. Frank was settling into his chair, exhausted, but happy, when his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something made him answer. The cold, unfamiliar voice cut through the apartment's warm atmosphere. Old man, you and your boxer friend made a big mistake. You took something that doesn't belong to you. The celebration stopped as Frank's face went pale. Around the room, veterans who'd survived combat in foreign wars felt familiar dread returning. Who is this? Frank demanded. Someone who knows where you live. Where all of you live. The voice was calm, professional, terrifying in its certainty. The community center was just business. What happens next is personal. The line went dead, leaving silence that felt heavier than any explosion. Margaret's phone buzzed with an urgent text. Her face went white as she read. Derek Williams released on bail 1 hour ago. Whereabouts, unknown. Tyson stood slowly, the peaceful evening shattered by the return of threat. Around the apartment, elderly veterans straightened in their chairs, warrior instincts awakening despite their age. It's not over, Frank said quietly. No, Tyson agreed, feeling the familiar weight of unfinished business. It's just beginning. Outside, Brooklyn's streets held shadows that hadn't been there an hour ago. The victory celebration had ended, and the real war was about to start. At 3:17 a.m., the fire alarm in Frank's building began screaming with electronic urgency that shattered the Brooklyn night. Residents stumbled from their apartments in pajamas and confusion, herded by building managers into the cold street as flames licked hungrily at third-floor windows. Frank stood across from his burning home, still wearing the clothes from yesterday's celebration, watching 50 years of memories turn to ash and smoke. The fire department arrived with professional efficiency, but everyone could see they were fighting a losing battle. Tyson found him there 20 minutes later, having raced across Brooklyn after Margaret's panicked phone call. The old veteran stood motionless as orange light danced across his weathered face, his expression empty of everything except loss. Jesus, Frank, Tyson breathed, putting a hand on the smaller man's shoulder. They waited, Frank said quietly, his voice eerily calm. Made sure I wasn't home. Professional work, accelerant, multiple ignition points, designed to destroy everything personal while looking accidental. The flames reached Frank's apartment, and through the broken windows they could see his life's collection burning. Military memorabilia, photographs of fallen comrades, 47 years of marriage certificates and love letters, all feeding the hungry fire. Fire Chief Danny Rodriguez approached with the grim expression of someone delivering terrible news. I'm sorry, Mr. Kowalski. The whole third floor is gone. Arson investigation will start tomorrow, but nothing's left to investigate, Frank finished. Margaret arrived in her car, still wearing scrubs from a late shift at the VA hospital. She took one look at Frank's face and understood that something had broken inside the tough old soldier. The Photos, Frank whispered, and for the first time his composure cracked. All the boys who didn't make it home. Jimmy Torino, killed at Da Nang. Mickey O'Brien, stepped on a mine outside Saigon. 43 pictures of my brothers, and now they're gone forever. His voice broke completely. They didn't just take my things, Mike. They took my boys. Tyson had seen strong men crumble before, in the ring, in prison, in life. But watching Frank's dignified facade shatter was somehow worse. This wasn't defeat by a superior opponent. This was the deliberate destruction of everything that made a life worth living. Margaret wrapped Frank in a blanket someone had provided, her social worker instincts taking over. We'll find you temporary housing. The VA has emergency assistance programs. It's not about the apartment, Frank said, staring at the flames. It's about erasing proof that I existed, that any of us existed. The fire burned for another 2 hours, consuming not just Frank's belongings but the security every veteran in the neighborhood had felt just yesterday. The message was clear. Victory celebrations were premature, and the real enemy had resources they'd only begun to understand. As dawn broke over Brooklyn, Frank stood in the ruins of his temporary home, holding the only thing that had survived, his Bronze Star, protected in the small fireproof safe that had been his one concession to paranoia. He pinned the medal to his jacket with hands that trembled from rage rather than age, then looked at Tyson with eyes that had rediscovered their warrior edge. They want a war with an old soldier? Frank said quietly. They got one. But even as he spoke the brave words, Tyson could see the deeper damage. The fire had taken more than possessions. It had stolen the gentle dignity that had made Frank special, replacing it with something harder and more dangerous. The real war was just beginning. Margaret's emergency call came at 6 a.m., her voice tight, with the kind of discovery that changed everything. Mike, Frank, you need to get to my office immediately. I found her, the real enemy. The VA medical center felt different in the early morning hours, institutional hallways echoing with the footsteps of a handful of dedicated employees who arrived before the rest of the world woke up. Margaret's office looked like the workspace of someone who hadn't slept. Coffee cups stacked on every surface and documents spread across every available space. Dr. Patricia Holloway, Margaret announced without preamble, placing an official photograph on her desk. Assistant Director of Veterans Benefits Administration. She's not just selling information, she's running the entire operation. The woman in the photo looked like everyone's ideal of a compassionate public servant. Auburn hair styled professionally. Intelligent eyes behind expensive glasses. The kind of authoritative but approachable appearance that inspired trust in vulnerable populations. Frank studied the image with the intensity of a soldier identifying an enemy combatant. You're sure? Positive. Margaret opened her laptop, revealing screens of data that represented weeks of careful investigation. Database access logs, financial records, even her personal calendar. It all matches the pattern of attacks. She pulled up a complex spreadsheet showing benefit payment schedules cross-referenced with robbery incidents. Every single attack happened within 72 hours of Dr. Holloway accessing that victim's records. She wasn't just providing information, she was selecting targets. Tyson leaned over the computer, his street-smart mind immediately grasping the scope of the betrayal. How long? 3 years, Margaret replied grimly. Started small, maybe 1 or 2 veterans per month. But it's been escalating. Last month alone, she accessed over 200 files. The implications were staggering. While veterans trusted the VA system to protect their personal information, someone at the highest levels was systematically hunting them for profit. She has unlimited database access, Margaret continued, authority to modify benefit schedules and the political connections, to make investigations disappear. When Derek got arrested 6 months ago, she pulled strings to get the charges dropped. Frank's military mind was already calculating strategic implications. If she's been doing this for 3 years across multiple boroughs, hundreds of victims. Margaret confirmed. Maybe thousands. And it's not just robbery, identity theft, benefits fraud, Medicare scams. She's been using veteran information to fund a criminal empire. She pulled up Dr. Holloway's financial records, obtained through Margaret's careful cultivation of contacts throughout the VA system. Bank accounts, real estate purchases, luxury car payments, all far beyond what any government salary could support. $3 million in unexplained income over 2 years, Margaret said. She's been living like a millionaire on the backs of men who fought for this country. Tyson felt familiar rage building in his chest, but this was different. From the anger that had powered his boxing career. This was moral fury at the deepest kind of betrayal, the corruption of sacred trust. Where is she now? He asked. Margaret's expression darkened. That's the problem. She disappeared yesterday, right after news broke about the community center. Right. Her assistant says she had a family emergency, but you don't believe it, Frank finished. I think she's running, Margaret said. Or worse, escalating. Someone with her resources and connections doesn't just disappear. She's planning something. Frank stood and walked to Margaret's window, looking out at the medical center's parking lot where vulnerable veterans arrive daily for treatment and benefits. She knows we're closing in, knows her operation is blown. Cornered animals are the most dangerous, Tyson observed. Margaret's phone buzzed with an urgent text message. Her face went white as she read. All veteran group therapy sessions canceled. Indefinitely. Emergency order from Dr. Holloway's office, issued 1 hour ago. The three of them stared at each other, understanding flooding through the room like cold water. The canceled sessions weren't protective measures, they were tactical preparations. She's not running, Frank said quietly. She's setting a trap. Tyson pulled out his phone, dialing Detective Martinez's number. But even as he made the call, he knew they were already behind the curve. Dr. Patricia Holloway had 3 years of preparation, unlimited resources, and nothing left to lose. The real enemy had finally shown herself, and she was more dangerous than any street criminal they'd faced at Frank's new apartment. A temporary VA housing unit in Prospect Heights had been transformed into a military briefing room within hours of Margaret's revelation. The small living space buzzed with quiet efficiency as 8 men between the ages of 67 and 79 answered their brother's call to arms. Bobby Chin arrived first, his Korean War service evident in the way he surveyed the apartments. Tactical advantages and vulnerabilities. Tony Moretti followed, still favoring his injured shoulder but moving with renewed purpose. William Red Sullivan brought 40 years of post-war police experience along with his World War II medals. Each man who entered carried the weight of decades, but also the unshakable foundation of military training that never truly faded. They'd answered the call because Frank had asked, and Frank had earned their loyalty through blood and shared sacrifice. Brothers, Frank began, his voice carrying the authority of a lifetime soldier. We're facing an enemy who's declared war on every veteran in this city. He'd prepared a briefing that would have impressed active duty intelligence officers. Maps covered the walls showing attack locations, victim profiles, and the scope of Dr. Holloway's network. Financial documents detailed the millions stolen from veteran benefits. Database printouts revealed the systematic targeting of the most vulnerable among them. Dr. Patricia Holloway, Frank continued, pointing to the official photograph. 3 years of betrayal, hundreds of victims, millions in stolen benefits. She's not just a criminal, she's a traitor to everything we fought for. The assembled veterans studied the intelligence with professional interest. These men had faced enemy forces in Korea, Vietnam, and Europe. They understood warfare, recognized tactical situations, and knew how to respond when their brothers were threatened. What's our mission? Asked Eddie Kowalski, no relation to Frank, a Navy veteran who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam before becoming a master electrician in civilian life. Margaret stepped forward, her role as intelligence officer clear. Dr. Holloway has gone underground, but she's not running. Financial analysis suggests she's consolidating resources for one final operation, something big enough to fund permanent disappearance. She's got $3 million in stolen money, Frank added, plus connections throughout the VA system, criminal contacts across 5 boroughs, and nothing left to lose. Tyson, who'd been quietly observing from the corner, finally spoke. She's planning to eliminate witnesses. All of us. The room went quiet as the implications sank in. This wasn't about recovering stolen money or seeking justice through proper channels. This was about survival against an enemy with superior resources and institutional protection. Gentlemen, Frank said, straightening to his full height despite the cane, I'm not asking you to fight. We've all done our service, paid our dues. But if you're willing to stand with me one more time, Frank, Bobby interrupted gently. You don't need to ask. We're family. Red Sullivan nodded agreement. Serve together, fight together. That's how it's always been. Tony Moretti stood despite his injuries. My grandfather fought in the First War, my father in the Second. They didn't quit when things got hard. One by one, each veteran in the room stood, forming an informal honor guard around their brother Frank. Decades of civilian life fell away, revealing the soldiers who'd never really left the service. Equipment? Asked Jimmy Rodriguez, an Army Ranger who'd become a construction foreman after Vietnam. Frank smiled for the first time since his apartment burned. Margaret's been busy. Legal surveillance equipment, body cameras, communication, devices. Everything we need to document whatever Dr. Holloway is planning. And if documentation isn't enough? Eddie asked quietly. Frank's expression hardened. Then we remember that we swore an oath to defend this country from enemies foreign and domestic. Tyson stood, joining the circle of veterans. I'm not military, but I'm family. Cuz taught me that we protect our own. Frank looked around the room at 8 men who'd volunteered to face unknown danger rather than abandon their brothers. One more mission, boys. For every veteran who trusted his government to protect him. The briefing continued past midnight. Elderly warriors planning their final campaign with the precision that had kept them alive through foreign wars. Outside, Brooklyn slept peacefully, unaware that its heroes were preparing for battle once again. The brotherhood that had formed in distant conflicts was about to face its greatest test on home soil. Dr. Patricia Holloway's warehouse in Queens rose from the industrial landscape like a fortress, its concrete walls and strategic location chosen specifically for the confrontation she'd been planning since the community center raid. At 11 p.m., the building was surrounded by 15 armed men, a combination of Castellanos' surviving crew and professional muscle hired with 3 years of stolen veteran benefits. Tyson arrived alone as instructed, walking through the main entrance. With the casual confidence of someone who'd faced down impossible odds countless times before. The warehouse interior had been cleared for combat. Open space, multiple exits, overhead lighting that eliminated shadows and hiding places. Mr. Tyson, Dr. Holloway called from the far end of the building, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. So good of you to come. She looked nothing like the compassionate public servant from her official photographs. Designer clothes replaced government-issued business suits. Expensive jewelry caught the harsh industrial lighting, and her expression held the cold calculation of someone who'd spent years viewing human lives as profit margins. Where's Frank? Tyson asked, though he could already see the answer. The old veteran sat tied to a chair in the center of the warehouse, conscious but bloodied from what appeared to be professional interrogation. His bronze star was still pinned to his jacket, a small act of defiance that spoke to unbroken spirit despite physical abuse. Mr. Kowalski is fine, Dr. Holloway said with false pleasantness. For now, we've been having a fascinating conversation about military service and sacrifice. She gestured to the armed men positioned throughout the warehouse, too many for even Mike Tyson to handle in a straight fight. You know, I always wondered what would happen if Iron Mike faced impossible odds. Tonight, we find out. Tyson took a step forward, and immediately half a dozen weapons pointed in his direction. The positioning was professional, overlapping fields of fire that left no avenue of escape. You're past your prime, Tyson, Dr. Holloway continued, circling him like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. This isn't the ring. There are no rules here, no referees to save you when you're beaten. Rules never stopped me before, Tyson replied quietly. Her laugh was genuinely amused. 3 years of planning, millions of dollars in resources, 15 armed professionals. What do you have? Fading reflexes and misplaced loyalty to men who should have died in foreign wars decades ago. Frank raised his head despite obvious pain, making eye contact with Tyson across the warehouse. No words were needed. The old soldier was ready to die, fighting rather than live as a hostage. Here's how this works, Dr. Holloway said, pulling out a tablet that showed bank account information. $3 million in untraceable cryptocurrency, generated by selling the personal information of men too stupid to protect themselves. She swiped to another screen showing airline tickets. By morning, I'll be in a country with no extradition treaty, living comfortably on money stolen from heroes who trusted their government. Tyson's hands remained at his sides, but every line of his body suggested coiled violence waiting for the right moment to explode. The only question, Dr. Holloway continued, is whether Mr. Kowalski dies quickly or slowly. That depends entirely on your cooperation. She nodded to her man, and they began closing the circle, weapons trained on Tyson from multiple angles. The trap was perfect. No escape routes, overwhelming firepower, innocent life hanging in the balance. "Any last words?" she asked mockingly. Tyson smiled, the expression holding no warmth but infinite confidence. "Yeah, you picked the wrong veterans to hunt." Dr. Holloway's expression shifted from triumph to confusion. "What does that mean?" That's when the lights went out, and the warehouse erupted in coordinated chaos. The warehouse plunged into absolute darkness as Eddie Kowalski's electrician expertise cut power to the entire industrial block. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in hellish red that turned the building into a battlefield where experience trumped youth and military precision overwhelmed street tactics. Frank wasn't bound to any chair. That had been theater for Dr. Holloway's benefit. The moment the lights failed, he rolled away from his position and produced a military-grade flashlight, illuminating targets for the coordinated assault he'd been planning since his apartment burned. Bobby Chin's demolitions expertise announced itself with controlled explosions at 3 entry points, flashbangs designed to disorient rather than kill. The warehouse filled with smoke and confusion as 8 elderly veterans executed a coordinated assault that would have impressed active-duty special forces. Dr. Holloway's hired muscle, expecting to overwhelm one aging boxer, suddenly faced a platoon of warriors who'd learned urban warfare in Asian jungles and European cities. Red Sullivan's police training showed as he moved through shadows like a man 40 years younger, systematically eliminating threats with non-lethal precision. Tony Moretti, ignoring his injured shoulder, provided covering fire with a service pistol he'd legally carried for 4 decades. Each shot was carefully placed, disabling rather than killing, the marksmanship of someone who'd learned to conserve ammunition when every round mattered. Tyson used the chaos to advance toward Dr. Holloway's position, but the warehouse had become a maze of obstacles and armed opponents. A masked gunman emerged from behind stacked crates, automatic weapon spraying bullets wildly in the red-lit confusion. The man went down to Jimmy Rodriguez's perfectly executed tackle. 68 years old, but 40 years of construction work had kept the former Ranger in fighting shape. The weapon clattered across concrete as Rodriguez applied a chokehold that rendered his opponent unconscious in seconds. Dr. Holloway screamed orders that no one could follow in the coordinated chaos. Her careful plan was dissolving under assault from men who'd spent lifetimes learning how to fight when everything went wrong. "Abort! Abort!" she yelled into a radio that couldn't reach her scattered forces. But Vincent Castellano appeared from the warehouse's office area, automatic pistol in his hands and murder in his eyes. The crime boss had been waiting for this moment. Revenge against the man who destroyed his operation and humiliated his crew. "Iron Mike," he called through the smoke and darkness. "Time to finish this." Tyson turned toward the voice, but Frank was already moving. The old soldier launched himself at Castellano with the desperate courage that had earned his Bronze Star 6 decades ago, tackling the younger man just as he fired. The bullet went wide, but Castellano was stronger and younger than the 78-year-old veteran. They rolled across the warehouse floor, fighting for control of the weapon, until Castellano managed to throw Frank off and raise the gun again. And that's when a new voice cut through the chaos. Calm, professional, and infinitely dangerous. "You, gentlemen having trouble with some old men?" Lance, the Hammer, Morrison stepped out of the shadows, 6'2" of trained violence in military-style clothing. Dr. Holloway's personal enforcer had been waiting for exactly this moment, studying Tyson's fighting style and planning how to end the legend's career permanently. "Lance," Dr. Holloway called gratefully, "kill them all, and let's get out of here." But Lance's attention was focused entirely on Tyson, professional respect mixing with anticipation in his cold gray eyes. "Always wanted to test myself against Iron Mike. Let's see if the legend lives up to the hype." Around them, The battle raged as elderly veterans systematically dismantled Dr. Holloway's security force. But in the warehouse's center, two very different kinds of violence prepared to collide in what might be Mike Tyson's final fight. Lance Morrison moved like liquid death in the warehouse's emergency lighting, every step calculated to maximize advantage against an opponent he'd studied obsessively. At 28, he possessed everything Tyson had lost to age: speed, reflexes, and the conditioning of someone who'd made violence his full-time profession. 20 years past your prime, Lance said, circling like a predator. Let's see what's left. His first combination came faster than anything Tyson had faced in years. Jab, cross, hook delivered with MMA precision and youth's cruel speed. Tyson slipped most of it, but the hook tagged his ribs with enough force to remind him that his body had absorbed 40 years of punishment. Lance immediately followed up, mixing boxing with wrestling techniques that had never existed when Tyson ruled the heavyweight division. A perfectly timed takedown sent both men crashing to the concrete floor, where Lance's ground game training gave him every advantage. For 90 seconds that felt like hours, Tyson absorbed punishment that would have finished most men half his age. Elbows and knees found their marks. Submission attempts tested joints that creaked with decades of wear. This wasn't the boxing ring where his experience meant everything. This was modern combat where youth and training seemed insurmountable. Lance postured up to deliver finishing strikes, and Tyson saw his own death reflected in those cold gray eyes. But somewhere in the warehouse's smoke and chaos, Frank's voice cut through the violence. "'Cause taught you to be a warrior, not just a fighter." The words hit Tyson harder than any physical blow. Suddenly, he wasn't just an aging boxer trying to recapture past glory. He was the spiritual heir to a man who'd carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, who'd taught that strength without purpose was just violence. That Tyson's right hand, pinned beneath Lance's knee, found something that felt like destiny. Not technique or conditioning or the advantages of youth, but the iron will that had always separated him from pretenders to his throne. The uppercut traveled maybe 6 inches, thrown from an impossible angle with all the accumulated power of a lifetime spent perfecting violence. It caught Lance flush on the point of his chin with surgical precision, lifting the younger man clear off Tyson's body. Lance hit the warehouse floor like falling timber, unconscious before his head bounced off concrete. The fight was over in the space between heartbeats, decided not by youth or training, but by something deeper and more fundamental. Tyson rolled to his knees, blood streaming from a dozen cuts, ribs aching where Lance's techniques had found their mark. But he was alive, standing, and looking around for Dr. Holloway. She was backed against the warehouse wall, her expensive outfit torn and her composed facade finally cracked. Around the building, her security force had been systematically neutralized by 8 elderly veterans who'd remembered how to be soldiers when their brothers needed them. "It's over," Tyson said simply, walking toward her with the measured pace of justice finally arriving. But Dr. Holloway pulled a small pistol from her jacket, pointing it not at Tyson but at Frank, who was helping Bobby Chin secure the last of the hired muscle. "One more step and the old man dies," she snarled, all pretense of civility abandoned. The warehouse went silent except for the sound of sirens growing louder in the distance. Margaret had timed the police response perfectly, long enough for the veterans to handle the situation, soon enough to prevent any permanent damage. Tyson stopped, hands visible but ready. "You shoot him, you've got nothing left to bargain with." "I've got $3 million and a plane waiting," Dr. Holloway replied. "All I need is enough time to reach it." Frank looked across the warehouse at Tyson, then at the woman who'd betrayed everything he'd fought for. "Mike, you remember what Cuz always said about bullies?" Tyson smiled despite the blood on his face. "They only stop when someone makes them stop." "That's right," Frank replied. And this bully stopped, with movements that belonged to a soldier. 60 years younger, Frank spun away from the gun's aim while simultaneously hurling his heavy flashlight with deadly accuracy. The improvised weapon struck Dr. Holloway's hand, sending the pistol spinning across the warehouse floor. She lunged for the weapon, but Tyson was already there, his foot pinning the gun to concrete while his presence made clear that her war was over. Detective Martinez and a dozen NYPD officers poured through the warehouse entrances, finding a scene that would become legend in both boxing and law enforcement circles. 8 elderly veterans had successfully executed a military-style assault, neutralizing 15 armed opponents without a single fatality. Dr. Patricia Holloway, Martinez announced, pulling out handcuffs. You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and about 50 other charges I'll think of on the way to the station. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Tyson looked around at the men who'd answered Frank's call. Bruised, bloodied, but victorious. Proof that courage and brotherhood never aged. The war was finally over. 2 weeks later, the federal courthouse in downtown Brooklyn became the center of a media circus as Dr. Patricia Holloway's arrest sent shockwaves through the Veterans Administration and law enforcement communities nationwide. Margaret stood at the courthouse steps, briefing reporters on the scope of the conspiracy that had stolen millions from America's heroes. 3 years of systematic fraud, she announced to the assembled cameras. Over 400 victims across 5 boroughs, with similar operations discovered in 12 other cities. The total damage exceeds $50 million in stolen benefits and personal property. Inside the courthouse, Dr. Holloway sat in federal custody, her expensive wardrobe replaced by orange jail scrubs. The woman who'd once commanded respect and authority now faced charges that would keep her imprisoned for the rest of her natural life. Derek Williams, facing his own serious charges, had become the prosecution's star witness. 3 weeks in jail had given him time to reflect on the path that had led him to rob elderly veterans for pocket change, while the real criminals lived in mansions purchased with stolen dignity. She made it seem patriotic, Derek testified, his voice carrying genuine remorse. Said we were collecting from people who were draining the system, taking money they didn't deserve. I was young and stupid enough to believe her. Detective Martinez had worked around the clock to build the federal case, coordinating with agencies across multiple states as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Vincent Castellano's organization had been just one tentacle of a massive criminal enterprise that had corrupted VA systems from coast to coast. Largest veterans benefits fraud in American history, Martinez explained to reporters. And it was cracked by a 78-year-old war hero and a retired heavyweight champion who refused to let criminals prey on their community. The stolen money was recovered in its entirety, cryptocurrency accounts frozen, offshore holdings seized, luxury assets liquidated to compensate victims. Bobby Chin's father's watch was found in Dr. Holloway's personal collection, along with dozens of other irreplaceable items that had been taken as trophies rather than sold for profit. Tony Moretti received a phone call from the FBI's recovery team. Mr. Moretti, we found your wife's jewelry. The pieces that were taken during your robbery, they're all here. Frank stood in Margaret's office, watching the news coverage with quiet satisfaction. The burned photographs couldn't be recovered, but the men they'd honored would be remembered through the justice that had finally been served. Cuz would be proud, Frank said to Tyson, who'd insisted on staying out of the media spotlight despite his central role in the investigation. He taught me to use my strength to protect people, Tyson replied. Guess I'm finally learning how to do it right. Derek's sentencing hearing became an unexpected moment of redemption. Instead of the maximum sentence he'd expected, the judge offered him a choice: 5 years in prison or 5 years of supervised community service working with veteran organizations. Your Honor, Derek said, standing before the bench, I'd like to spend those 5 years earning back what I can't ever really return, their trust. After the hearing, Derek approached Frank in the courthouse hallway, moving with the nervous energy of someone attempting something he'd never done before. Mr. Kowalski, he said quietly, I know sorry ain't enough, but I got a job now, construction work. Been saving money to pay back what I took, plus interest. Frank studied the young man's face, seeing something that hadn't been there during their first encounter. What changed? Mr. Tyson came to visit me in lockup, Derek replied. Didn't lecture me, didn't tell me I was worthless. Just asked if I wanted to be someone different than who I was. Took me 3 days to figure out the answer was yes. Frank extended his hand, and Derek shook it gratefully. Son, we all make mistakes. What matters is what you do next. The handshake was brief, but it represented something larger. The possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances, the chance for second chances when they're earned rather than demanded. Outside the courthouse, Brooklyn's veteran community gathered to celebrate justice finally served. But more than that, they celebrated the discovery that their brotherhood was stronger than any enemy who dared to threaten it. The war was over, and they had 1.3 months later, autumn sunlight streamed through the windows of Rosie's diner. As Mike Tyson sat in his usual corner booth, reading the morning paper over coffee that Betty had poured without being asked, some routines were too precious to change. Even after everything that had happened, the diner looked different now, better. Somehow, warmed by community pride and the knowledge that heroes still walked among ordinary people. A new memorial wall honored local veterans, featuring restored photographs that had been painstakingly recreated through military archives and community donations. Frank's picture held a place of honor among them. Not just his official army portrait from Vietnam, but a recent photo showing him surrounded by the 8 veterans who'd answered his final call to service. The caption read, "American heroes, then and always." The bell above the door chimed its familiar welcome as Frank entered, moving with more confidence than he'd shown in months. His new apartment, donated by a grateful veterans organization, had been furnished entirely through community contributions. The walls displayed his medals with proper respect, and new photographs showed his adopted family of elderly warriors who'd become closer than blood relatives. "Morning, Frank," Betty called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Booth 3's waiting." "Thank you, darling," Frank replied, settling into his regular spot with the satisfaction of a man who'd found his place in the world again. Eddie emerged from the kitchen, spatula in hand and genuine affection in his eyes. "Frank, you see the news? Derek made Employee of the Month at his construction job." The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Derek Williams, once a predator who'd hunted veterans for pocket change, now worked 10-hour days building affordable housing for senior citizens. His paycheck went toward restitution and community service, but more importantly, his attitude had undergone fundamental change. "Redemption's a beautiful thing," Frank observed, stirring sugar into his coffee with the careful precision of a man who'd learned to appreciate simple pleasures. The diner door opened again, and Derek himself entered. Work clothes dusty from his morning shift, attitude humble in a way that would have been unrecognizable 3 months ago. He'd gained weight from honest labor and regular meals, lost the predatory edge that had once made him dangerous. He approached Frank's table hesitantly, pulling out cash from his work jacket. "Mr. Kowalski, that's $400. What? I took from you, plus interest like I promised." Frank accepted the money, but also gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Sit down, son. Have some coffee." Derek's gratitude was obvious as he slid into the booth. "I wanted to tell you, I got accepted into night school, community college, studying to be an EMT. Figure it's time I started helping people instead of hurting them." "That's good work," Frank replied. "Honorable work. Your grandfather would be proud." The mention of family brought tears to Derek's eyes. "I lied about having a grandfather who served. Truth is, I never had any family who served anything but themselves. But maybe I can be the first." Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, a pin showing crossed American flags. "This was given to me by a Vietnam vet whose life I helped save 40 years ago. Maybe it's time it went to someone who's earning a second chance." Derek took the pin with reverent hands, understanding that it represented more than jewelry. It was acceptance into a brotherhood he'd once tried to destroy. From his corner booth, Tyson watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. The young man who'd once threatened Frank with violence was now seeking his guidance and approval. It was the kind of ending that proved Cuz D'Amato's teachings about redemption and second chances. Betty appeared with fresh coffee for everyone, her maternal instincts treating Derek like another member of the diner's extended family. "Derek, honey, you eaten today? Eddie's got fresh pancakes on the griddle." "That's very kind, ma'am, but I need to get back to work," Derek replied. "We're building a senior center over in Red Hook, and I don't want to let the crew down." He stood to leave, then turned back to Frank with an expression of gratitude that words couldn't adequately express. "Mr. Kowalski, I know I can never really make up for what I did, but I want you to know, every day I wake up trying to be someone worthy of your forgiveness." "Son," Frank said gently, "you already are." Derek nodded, overwhelmed by the grace he'd never expected to receive. He walked toward the door with the confident stride of someone who'd found purpose in honest work and service to others. As the door closed behind him, Frank raised his coffee cup toward Tyson's corner booth. The two men shared a moment of understanding that transcended words, acknowledgement of battles fought and won, of brotherhood that spanned generations and survived every test. Some fights you take because you have to, Tyson said quietly, speaking as much to himself as to Frank. Some you take because it's right. Frank nodded, completing the thought. The best ones you take for family. Outside, Brooklyn continued its eternal rhythm of struggle and hope, renewal and redemption. Inside Rosie's diner, heroes sat quietly, over coffee and breakfast, having learned that the greatest victories weren't won in boxing rings or foreign battlefields, but in the simple act of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The war was over, but the brotherhood would last forever. If you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.